Were my stalwart dwarves able to hold the line against a 50-strong unit of Chaos Demonettes? Find out today on Runeforged. Today I'm going over my 5th round game of the Old World Legends Winter Tournament, which was played online using warhall.eu. If you'd like to find out more about Warhall, there should be a link to do so down in the video description. This was a 2,000 point battle between my Dwarven Royal Clan and my opponent's Demons of Chaos. There should be an overview of our lists on the screen now, and if you'd like more detailed versions of those lists, those are available down in the video description. All right, so this game was played using a custom tournament scenario, which should be up on your screen now, so definitely feel free to pause if you want to read it at your own pace. But the TLDR version is that difficult terrain is even more difficult and also applies to flying units, and dangerous terrain is even more dangerous than usual. Overall, the scenario didn't really have a huge impact on how I personally played the game, and I think probably impacted my opponent more than it did me. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it in this video. All right, so this is what the board looked like after our Vanguard moves were completed. Overall, I am pretty happy with my deployment for this game. As you can see, I was lucky enough to get an impassable terrain feature in my deployment zone, which means I was able to employ one of my favorite bunker positions, where I anchor one side of my flank with the impassable terrain, and then I anchor the other with the Anvil of Doom. And I found this is a really great formation for armies that need to attack me and don't really have a great way of dealing with the very high toughness Anvil of Doom, especially since I put the Master Rune of Adamant on it, which for the purposes of this tournament means that the Anvil is toughness 10 in close combat, in addition to being toughness 7 against shooting attacks. I did do something a little bit different in this game than I normally do, and that was that I started my Runesmith Battle Standard Bearer in the unit of Iron Drakes as opposed to in the Longbeards. Now, eventually I am going to move that Runesmith back into the Longbeards, but for now, this is giving him a slightly increased dispel range, and he's also giving his magic resistance and the 5-up ward save to the Iron Drakes, who are probably going to be the target of most of my opponent's shooting, at least in the first couple of turns. Now, I did make a slight mistake in the placement of the Runesmith here, really just because I was placing on autopilot, and I've been experimenting with this idea where I put my Anvil of Doom on one side of my line to give me a 24-inch dispel radius on this side, and then I put the Runesmith on the opposite side of my line to give me an 18-inch dispel bubble on the other side. But in this game, I actually, for maybe the first time ever, was able to place my characters after my opponent placed theirs, and if I'd been paying attention, I would have noticed that both of his casters, the Demon Princes over here, were both on the left side of the board, which means that I probably should have moved my Runesmith from the right-hand side over to the left-hand side to make sure that I was in range for some of those crucial runes of spellbreaking a little bit later in the game. Also, I did take special care to make sure to align my king to where I expected my opponent's characters in this large demonette unit to be coming in if they wanted to come straight at me, but which is exactly what I expected my opponent to do in this situation. And just to talk briefly about my overall plan for this game, really it is quite simple. I really just want to put as much firepower as possible into this massive unit of demonettes to make sure that by the time it reaches my lines, my Longbeards should be able to handle them in close combat. Now, it is actually pretty rare that there is a unit or an enemy Death Star that I feel can take on the Longbeards straight up, but I do think the demonettes, especially if they get off some of their crucial magical buffs, I think one of them is called like Demonic Vessel. It gives them like +1 strength, +1 attack, and like +1 AP, which is absolutely insane. And then also they have another spell. I think it's like something of mutations or something. It's like the Zinch, one of the Zinch special abilities that can reduce the weapon skill, strength, and or toughness of one of my units by D3. And they can do 2 of those stats if they roll high. I definitely don't want the enemy to get into me while I have that debuff on me. So again, the plan, whittle down the demonettes as much as possible and make sure they don't have their crucial magic in place by the time that they're charging into my lines. I do also need to be a little bit concerned about the Chaos Furies and the Blood Crushers of Khorne, trying to get some sort of pretty nasty flanking attack on me. But I actually would be a lot more afraid if the Blood Crushers were actually deployed on the left side of the board over here, because I think they're actually going to have a really difficult time getting around behind me because of the presence of this impassable terrain feature, especially considering it is so close to the board edge. So I think in retrospect, my opponent probably should have put the Blood Crushers on the other side and just try to get into the back of the Longbeards and hopefully a simultaneous charge with the Blood Crushers from behind and then the Demonettes from the front. But again, because the Blood Crushers are on the other side of the board, I'm not as worried about that happening during this game. Now, I did want to point out another mistake that I made during my deployment. I didn't actually move this unit of Iron Drakes kind of far enough back, so they are kind of vulnerable to a flank charge here, and that might come up a little bit later in the game. All right, so if you were enjoying this battle report so far, please consider aiding me in my eternal struggle against the dreaded YouTube algorithm by crushing those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss out on more exciting old world content like this in the future. All right, so moving into Dwarf Turn 1, the first order of business was to use the Anvil to cast Rune of Oath and Steel on the Iron Drakes. I do get it off on the higher level version, which is going to give me +1 to my armor, and also is going to let me reroll failed armor saves. In retrospect, I probably should have used this opportunity to move both my Longbeards and my Iron Drakes back just a little bit to make sure that I'm not vulnerable to a flank charge later in the game, but I don't think that I noticed it at the time. Next, I went ahead and shot the Grudge Thrower and the Anvil of Doom into this very large unit of Demonettes, but unfortunately the Anvil failed to cast, and as a surprise to no one who's been watching the channel, the Grudge Thrower did scatter off target and didn't manage to inflict any damage during the first turn. And unfortunately, the Iron Drakes were out of range this turn, so no shooting coming out from them either. All right, moving on to Demon Turn 1. Basically, my opponent just moved his whole army forward, but unfortunately for him, pretty much all of his magic either fails or is dispelled by the Anvil of Doom, with the exception of the Pillar of Fire, which is probably the spell that I wanted to cast the least, but luckily for me, it is still pretty far away, and I should have a turn or two to dispel it before it does any significant damage. All right, moving on to Dwarf Turn 2. Again, I was able to successfully cast the Rune of Oath and Steel on the Iron Drakes, again at the higher level version, and I was able to dispel that potentially very menacing Pillar of Fire. Next, I move the cart over here to the right side, mostly just to get it out of the retreat path of the Iron Drakes when they inevitably have to fall back through my lines, and also potentially to maybe threaten these Chaos Furies if they decide they want to come around the backside of my line. Now, that's probably something of an empty threat, because as those of you who have been watching know, I haven't actually managed to do any damage with the cart over the course of maybe 15 or 16 games that I've played with this or a similar army list. But hopefully this will be the game where we break the streak and the cart ends up dealing some even minimal damage would be fantastic. All right, then during my shooting phase, I was able to take out 6 of the Demonettes, and I'm pretty sure that all of that damage was dealt by the Iron Drakes, as again, the Anvil failed to cast, and I'm pretty sure that the Grudge Thrower also missed on this turn, which once again is not particularly surprising. All right, moving into Demon Turn 2. My opponent did cast Steed of Shadows on the large unit of Demonettes, giving it a massive fly speed and push them forward into a position where they were threatening a charge on the Iron Drakes. I did want to remind y'all that in this scenario, difficult terrain is even more difficult than usual and also applies to creatures with fly, so he was hampered a little bit by the scenario when he was making this movement. And again, pretty much everything in his army is moving forward, with the biggest threats right now being the 2 units of Chaos Furies on my flanks. This one on the left side I'm not as worried about. I think that they're probably just going to bounce off the Anvil if they charge it. And I think there's a pretty decent chance that they also end up losing any combat that they do if they try to charge into the Longbeards as well. But what I am more worried about is this unit of Furies over here on the right side, which are now very skillfully positioned so that they are threatening a charge onto the Grudge Thrower on their next turn. So when it is my turn, I'm going to have to do something to deal with that threat. And unfortunately for my opponent, in the shooting phase, his magic missiles were not able to do any damage. I will say that especially for the early part of the game, the Anvil was definitely the MVP of Dispels, and I was able to shut down quite a bit of my opponent's magic, despite the fact that he had one caster, I think, casting on +5, and another one casting on +4. And my Anvil, of course, only being the equivalent of a level 3 wizard when it comes to dispels. So definitely pretty lucky for me on that front. All right, so moving into Dwarf Turn 3. Unfortunately, I did fail to cast the Rune of Oath and Steel on this turn, which is a little bit unfortunate because I think this is the turn where it's probably going to matter the most. During this turn, I do shift the Longbeards over just a little bit so that they are touching the edge of this impassable terrain, therefore cutting off any possibility of a charge from the Chaos Furies into my Grudge Thrower. I also then go ahead and move the Runesmith Battle Standard Bearer out of the Iron Drakes and back into this unit of Longbeards. I really don't want the Runesmith to be in the unit of Iron Drakes when they inevitably get charged. because I think there's a pretty good chance that even if he's not just outright slain, I would not be able to get him back into the unit of Longbeards before that unit was able to get into combat, and I would lose out on the 5 up ward save that the Runesmith is giving from his battle standard. And then also in the movement phase, I pivoted my cart back facing the other way, as I do fully expect these Furies to try and fly into my back line. And if they decide to do that, I want to be able to threaten them with a charge from the cart. Whether or not that charge will be successful, remains to be seen, but I at least wanted to threaten that possibility. During the shooting phase, I was able to take out 8 of the enemy demonettes. Again, most of the work being done by the Iron Drakes, but perhaps by some miracle, the Grudge Thrower did manage to land a hit and take out a couple of the demonettes. All right, so moving into Demon Turn 3, my opponent was able to cast Gathering Darkness on the unit of Iron Drakes, which is going to debuff their leadership by 2 and prevent me from using my general's leadership, even if he is in range. I think during his turn, he also got off a demonic vessel and a gift of mutation, but I was able to use 2 of my 3 runes of spellbreaking to automatically dispel those very dangerous buffs and debuffs, while still remaining to keep 1 rune of spellbreaking in reserve in case my opponent decided to delay his charge by another turn. My opponent did also elect to charge his unit of Chaos Furies into the Iron Drakes over here. And unfortunately for me, he was able to get a flanking charge. As I mentioned earlier, both of my big units should have been shifted back probably about like an inch or so. And the Iron Drakes probably should have been shifted over a little bit more to the right. I think I was trying to create room for my Grudge Thrower to have line of sight, but in retrospect, it was not at all worth it. I should have done a better job of protecting this right flank. And then also in a very clever play, my opponent moved his Blood Crushers up so that they were in base to base with his unit of Furies, which meant that even if he lost this combat and gave ground, he wouldn't be able to go anywhere, which means that my Iron Drakes would still be stuck in combat and wouldn't be able to shoot or stand and shoot against the Demonettes when they inevitably made their charge. All right, and then over here on the left flank, you can see my opponent has moved his Chaos Furies into something of a conga line. And again, a very clever play from my opponent. Basically, the idea here was that if my Longbeards ended up losing this combat and either ended up falling back in good order or fleeing, there's a very real possibility that I would simply go off the edge of the board because there really wouldn't be a lot of space along this line for me to retreat to. It would probably push me all the way off the edge of the board. So again, some very clever play coming out from my opponent during this turn. In terms of other magic, my opponent was also able to get a Pillar of Fire off, and I won't have time to dispel it before it moves at the start of my turn. So it is kind of setting up for a pretty nasty run through 3 of my units. But unfortunately for my opponent in the combat phase, the unit of Chaos Furies does actually end up bouncing off of the Iron Drakes. And due to an unlucky roll on his leadership test, ended up losing, I think, 5 of his Furies as a result of demonic instability. So definitely a little bit of an unfortunate situation for my opponent, as in like in an alternate timeline, they ended up winning this combat and the Iron Drakes fled completely off the board. So definitely a pretty good outcome for me during this combat. All right, so moving into Dwarf Turn 4. At the start of my turn, the Pillar of Fire does end up going through the Anvil, the Iron Drakes, and the Longbeards, but is only able to take out 1 of the Longbeards. And then I immediately dispel the Pillar with the Anvil. During my movement phase, I do reform the Longbeards here to expand my frontage by 1, as well as to move my king over to the far left side of the unit, so that if the Demonettes do manage to charge, he will hopefully be in base to base with both the enemy Demon Lord, as well as the Herald of Slanesh, who is also his battle standard bearer. And I do feel pretty confident that if my king is able to get into base to base with these 2 characters, that he should be able to take them out in pretty short order. Also, in retrospect, there's an argument to be made for moving my Runesmith a little bit further over in the unit, especially if I may have been outside of the 18-inch dispel range for my last Rune of Spellbreaking, but it's not something that occurred to me in the moment. Fortunately for me, during the shooting phase, I was able to take out another 10 Demonettes, again, largely as a result of the Iron Drakes. But once again, for the second time during this game, the Grudge Thrower actually managed to land a fairly solid hit, again, after scattering. I think I only managed to take out like 1 Demonette with the Grudge Thrower's turn due to some bad rolls, but that's still like infinitely more damage than it usually does, so I don't really feel like I can complain. I think I ended up casting the Anvil's Magic Missile into this unit of Furies over here. I either failed to cast it or it was dispelled by one of the Demon Princes. All right, so moving into Demon turn 4. My opponent was able to get a Demonic Vessel off on his Demonettes. Then my opponent declares charges onto the Anvil from the Demon Prince, and again he charges back into the Iron Drakes with his Chaos Furies. I can't remember. He did give me some reasoning for why he didn't want to charge here with the Demonettes. I don't remember what that was. I do think that one of the major issues is that this unit is just a little bit too wide, and also the Furies were blocking him somewhat. But I think he probably could have still made a disordered charge into me, and the disordered charge doesn't really matter that much against me because I'm going to be striking last anyway. But I think this unit is just a little bit too wide to fit in between the Anvil and the impassable terrain. And if it was, maybe 2 or 3 models less wide, then he probably could have gotten in here a little bit easier. And then after the charges, he does move this unit of Furies behind my lines and is threatening a charge into the Grudge Thrower over here. He also placed himself really well so that he was outside of the effective charge range of my card. So I will have to wait for him to charge into the Grudge Thrower and probably lose it before I end up doing my counter charge. And even more likely is that he just wipes the Grudge Thrower and then overruns into me. But I don't really feel like there's a whole lot that I can do in the situation. And it's really not that important if he does end up taking out the Grudge Thrower and the Dwarf Cart, as long as I'm able to secure some points of my own. Then in the close combat phase, the Demon Prince and the Anvil are unable to do any damage to each other, so they are pretty predictably just kind of stuck in that combat. Then unfortunately for my opponent, once again, the Furies do manage to bounce off of the Iron Drakes and basically end up crumbling as a result of the demonic instability. So once again, pretty lucky outcome for me during that fight. All right, moving on to Dwarf turn 5. And then I shift the cart backwards ever so slightly. So if you wanted to go ahead and charge the cart directly, it would be a very, very difficult charge for him to make. In my shooting phase, I'm able to take a staggering 12 Demonettes out on this turn. In combat, the Demon Prince does manage to inflict a wound on the Anvil. But again, because I am unbreakable and in terrain, I don't end up giving that additional ground. So we are still stuck in this combat. All right, so moving into Demon turn 5, and arguably the most important turn of the game. The Furies do elect to charge into my Grudge Thrower. Also, the Blood Crushers declare a charge into the flank of my Iron Drakes. And because I'm not able to get a good stand and shoot off in this situation, and I think it is pretty likely that the Blood Crushers are going to do some pretty significant damage on this charge, I do elect to flee with the Iron Drakes. Now, this does come with the unfortunate side effect of me fleeing back through several enemy units. And I actually end up losing 7 Iron Drakes as I flee through the enemy. Ultimately, I still think this was probably the best choice, as I do think that there's a reasonable chance that the Blood Crushers are able to do more damage than that. It probably would have resulted in the same outcome of me fleeing through the enemy. This also does put my opponent in a little bit of a precarious situation on this charge, and he ends up redirecting into the Longbeards. I'm not sure if my opponent was expecting me to flee in this situation, because if I do, it doesn't really feel like there's any good outcome for these Blood Crushers, because if he elects to pursue me or fails to make his leadership charge on the redirect, there's a chance that he just kind of ends up in front of my Longbeards and then in my charge range. And if I charge with the Longbeards into the Blood Crushers, that's really bad for him. But also, I'm not really that worried about the redirect either. I'm just not sure if there is a good outcome for him in this situation, especially if I elect to flee from this combat. For other move, my opponent is able to get a Steed of Shadows off on this unit of Demonettes and elects to fly over my Longbeards. I think that the thought process here was that even if I was able to destroy this unit of Blood Crushers, and I did a Restrain Reform and pivot around so that I was facing the Demonettes, I would only have one more turn in order to get a charge off on them. And that charge is actually very difficult to make as a result of me being in the difficult terrain. In retrospect, it may have been better to try and fly the other direction, and just hope that I get a really terrible overrun, and that again my charge falters as a result of having to charge through this difficult terrain. During the close combat phase, the Furies are able to inflict a single wound on the Grudge Thrower, and I am able to inflict none in return. So I end up losing the combat. I pop Stubborn, and I actually end up fleeing around the impassable terrain and end up behind my cart. I don't think either of us were really that sure about how this should have played out, but this seemed like the most reasonable outcome. But if you have a better understanding of how this scenario should have played out, definitely let me know down in the comments section. And of course, the Furies elected to pursue. and did end up pursuing directly into my Dwarven cart. So unfortunately not able to get the charge off with the cart. Moving on to the combat between the Blood Crushers and the Longbeards, I do issue a challenge with my king, which the champion accepts. And obviously the purpose of this challenge is to make sure that my king is getting his full attacks in this combat, and also to save my runesmith / battle standard bearer from the attacks from the enemy champion. And ultimately, this unit of Longbeards is able to completely destroy those Blood Crushers. And ultimately, I spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not I want to try to overrun and maybe get a charge into this Demon Prince on my next turn, or if I want to restrain and reform and try to go back into the unit of Demonettes over here. Ultimately, I do decide to do a restrain and reform. And during my reform, I reduced my frontage so that I would not have to pass through the difficult terrain of the pond here, and was able to set myself up for a pretty juicy rear charge on this unit of Demonettes. All right, so moving into Dwarf Turn 6. Now, since I had elected to flee with this unit of Iron Drakes on the previous turn, I did need to make a rally check in the hopes that I wouldn't be just running completely off the board. And that was made much more complicated by the presence of this Gathering Darkness, which put me at -2 leadership and did not let me use my general's leadership in order to make that check. So basically it was a coin flip whether or not I was going to keep running or if I was able to rally. I think I ended up rolling like a 2 on my leadership check. So I was able to rally these Iron Drakes and save them from running off the board. And of course, during my turn, I elected to charge this unit of Longbeards into the back of the Demonettes. And on my charge roll, I did actually manage to roll double 6s. And so ultimately, it didn't end up mattering that I was able to avoid this difficult terrain. But of course, there was no way to know that ahead of time. As part of my rally action, I was able to do a reform on this unit of Iron Drakes, basically just spinning them around on 180. And during the shooting phase, I ended up taking some pot shots at this Demon Prince. Unfortunately, my Trollhammer Torpedo did whiff, as it often does, but I was still able to inflict 1 wound on that Demon Prince. In the close combat phase, the Demon Prince was able to inflict another wound onto the Anvil, and did win the combat by 1. But again, because I am unbreakable and cannot give ground in terrain, we do stay locked in this combat for the remainder of the game. In this combat between the Furies and the cart, I think the Furies did manage to inflict 1 wound on the cart. And despite being very, very close to the cart inflicting its first ever wound on an enemy, my opponent was able to save using his demonic ward. But fortunately for me, I only ended up giving ground and just pushed back into the Grudge Thrower, so I didn't end up going very far. And as you can see in the combat between the Longbeards and the Demonettes, I was able to do some pretty significant damage. Although it did come at the cost of taking a single wound on my Runesmith Battle Standard Bearer, and I actually got pretty lucky because I think there was a chance that he just died there, which would have given up quite a bit of extra points. Ultimately, my opponent ended up giving ground, and of course, I followed up, but not before drilling out to get some additional frontage for the next round of combat. All right, moving on to Daemon Turn 6 and the last turn of the game. The Demon Prince General did end up using the Summoning Magic Missile on this unit of Iron Drakes. And after some very lucky rolls, was able to take out, I think, like 6 of them, which did prompt a panic test, which I promptly failed and ended up fleeing towards the edge of the board. A little bit unfortunate for me in this situation is this unit would now be giving up 75% of its victory points. And before that happened, I was actually not giving up any points in this game so far. So a little bit unfortunate there on kind of one of the last rolls of the game that I did end up giving up a pretty chunky amount of victory points to my opponent. But I don't really feel like I can complain that much because I've had some pretty good luck throughout the course of the game. And then in the only combat that really mattered, my Longbeards were able to wipe out the rest of the Demonettes in this combat, completely destroying that unit. All right, so that was the end of the game. Let's go ahead and take a look at the final score. After all the points were tallied, my opponent scored 278 points, and I was able to pick up 1,276 victory points for a difference of 998, which did end up making this a 15-5 win for me on battle points, and put my total record for the tournament at 3 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw. Overall, this was a really good game. I definitely went in with a pretty solid plan, and I felt like I was able to execute on that plan pretty well. I should also mention that it definitely felt like luck was on my side during the crucial moments of this game, and probably resulted in a less close game than it probably should have been. I did want to give a quick shout out to my opponent who had some really clever like movement related plays with Furies, and had the dice rolls gone just a little bit different in some of those key situations, definitely could have resulted in a very different game. Also, he was just like a really good sport throughout the entire match, even when the dice were not going his way. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider checking out this next battle report, which should be popping up on your screen right about now. Also, please make sure that you are subscribed to the channel if you don't want to miss out on the round 6 game of this tournament, which I should be posting on the channel sometime in the next week. But I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.